Welcome to the Business Trendsetter podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
We're Spark Partners. We're here every week delivering you all kinds of insights on trends and how to use them. They're everywhere. And me and Adam spend a lot of time studying them. And in our podcast, we bring forth these topics. We talk about them. We make some predictions. And almost to a one, they all come true. And it's not saying that we're soothsayers or we're some sort of crazy tea leaf readers or whatever, but we just look at the trends. We look at where they're going. And if you look at what's happening now in business, they're all aligned with these trends. So one of those, of course, we've discussed is the things happening with commercial real estate. And that folds into the trend of the gig economy, AI, and all these other things, mobility. So let's kick it off there, Adam, talk about that. And then if we have time, we'll dovetail into a couple other ones that are sort of related to that. One of those is demographics, where people live, how they're moving, their ages and all that. And we'll kind of go from there. And at the very end, if we have more time, we can delve into some new topics after that. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay. Well, I guess we can start off talking about electrification. And I was pretty impressed this morning, Manny, when you sent me that article you'd found where somebody said that we weren't going to be able to electrify the automotive fleet. And they had a list of reasons that we couldn't do so. You know, they were saying that there weren't enough chargers, there weren't going to be enough batteries. There was going to, the electric grid would get shut down because of too much consumption. And, you know, I just had to chuckle when I was reading it because what was there was actually a lot of nonsense. There were these assertions made in the article, and the assertions were just absolutely wrong. But it reminded me that if you weren't a student of trends, you could read this and you could be influenced by it. And you could say, oh, wait a minute, I heard Adam say, or I heard Manny say, these good things are going to happen. Now here's somebody on the other side. And oh, this is the other side of the coin. And so each one I should listen to equally. And that's why I started chuckling, because this sort of false idea that there's more than one viewpoint and we should treat them all equal is what gets business people in a lot of trouble. When they don't know the answer to a question, instead of getting data and finding an expert and really trying to understand why the experts, where that point of view comes from, what data do they have to support it, they'll say, well, let me just screen the headlines, let me listen to a few people, and I want to try to weight all of them equally. And then what happens is they end up reverting to what's actually they'll call their gut instinct, or what their gut says. But what their gut says is really biased. We talked about that a lot last week about how you get biased, and therefore they kind of pick the wrong things. So, for example, that's what's happening in EVs. So 2 or 3 weeks ago, some results came out, and they talked about the fact that EV sales, there was inventory. We went over this in the podcast, that there was inventory, 100 days inventory, and that the average price had come down. And people were saying that was bad. And in reality, it was actually very good. Because what was happening was that the EV manufacturers were lowering price to increase volume. One of the things that's come out since that, again, tracking trends, getting the data, one of the things that came out was that the manufacturers of EVs are starting to produce a line of cars in which the battery has a range of about 260 miles. So it's a smaller battery. Now, and that because they use a smaller battery with a lower range, they can lower the price of the vehicle. Now, range anxiety for a long time was what kept people from buying a car. And I have a friend who lives in Las Vegas, and his parents live in Los Angeles, and he regularly makes the drive from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, and I think it's about 400 miles or something. Anyway, he's right at this point where he says, I'm not ready to buy an EV because I need to be able to make this one drive in one charge. And I'm kind of like, I understand his point of view. He really has something he does almost every 2 weeks, if not more often. It's a long drive, but he is so exceptional. The vast majority of us rarely make those long drives. I recently did a driving vacation, and we drove over the course of a week. We drove about 800 miles, but we didn't drive 400 miles in any one day. And we easily could have stopped, power up an EV if we needed to. We clearly had time in the evenings to power up the EV if we wanted to. And so the reality is that for the vast majority of people, you'd be smarter to have a cheaper vehicle that had 260-mile range, and you're keeping it charged up and you're driving it. And then if you do want to take a long drive, go to Avis, go to Hertz, go rent a car. Something else that you want. Maybe get an ICE vehicle for that particular kind of a trip if that's what you want to do. If you look at fleets, for example, I've tracked a lot of fleet a lot of fleet usage in the last 30 years. And the reality is that 99% of fleet cars, maybe 99 point something percent of fleet cars, are never driven more than 50 miles from the base location. You know,
Yeah.
there's a corporate car which is used by a salesman or it's used by a service technician, whatever, and these all come to one place at night, and they all go out in the daytime. Rarely go more than 50 miles, right? You look at UPS trucks. The UPS truck, very few UPS trucks drive over 50 miles from their distribution center. So those become ideal for electric vehicles because now you start saying, wait a minute, these things, they're not going to drive more than 150, 200 miles in a day. We put a smaller battery, we get the cost down, we charge them up every night, right? And you can now organize, you can have your own solar station at the distribution center. You can tap into your own wind farms, whatever you want to do to try to keep that cost at bay. And you also can install batteries of power wall type technology so that in the daytime you're pulling in a lot of power that comes into that. You could even have replaceable batteries in the truck, you know, where they come in at night and somebody pulls all the batteries out, puts fresh batteries in, you charge those up the next day in the daylight. So what we have to be careful of is that we look at the right data. You know, we look at and we interpret the data in terms of what's happening. And right now, what we're seeing is the manufacturers are out there going for shorter range drives, getting the price down, getting the volume up. And then the second part of this is that the range anxiety problem goes away when you have enough charging stations, right? And the good news is we reported a year ago, and we've been talking about, you know, ever since, is that the federal government has put up all this money, you know, $500 million to go out and build out a charging network so that you can always be able to pull in and charge somewhere. Now, you might find that you pulled into a charging station and it's a low power station and it's going to take you 45 minutes to get a charge. But that's becoming increasingly rare. Those were the early stations, and most of those are being swapped out for more high powered stations. And we now know that the North American standard, which is the trademark name for the Tesla charging system, is now becoming widespread. Mercedes,
Right.
GM, Ford, well, I think
All the
16
big
auto
ones. Yeah.
manufacturers have signed on to that. So when it's not even that people today they're not even early adopters in EVs anymore. The EV early adopters were 10 years ago. It's now very much becoming mainstream, and you should take that in that context. Meaning, if you've got a fleet truck, where are you going next, right? Are you out there? Are you thinking about the fact that you should be working with manufacturers to come up with an electrified set of vehicles for your fleet? If you've got fleet cars, you know, are you thinking about that and applying it in your business? Because understanding trends, the reason you want to do that is so that you get ahead of the curve and you get productivity improvements. And in the EV market, one of the things we're seeing is that it does lower your costs and you do get productivity improvements, right? Now, the other side of this is obviously the counties and government typically is far behind. It occasionally gets in front of the curve, but most of the time government's far behind. And one of the places governments are far behind here is that as the federal government keeps doing more and more to promote electrification, we forget that our roadways have been paid for by gas taxes. So when you buy
Hmm.
gasoline at the pump or diesel fuel at the pump, part of that was a gasoline tax. Most of it went to the state, a chunk of it went to the city, and it was paid for your pothole improvements, you know, and taking care of those kinds of problems. The good news was that when somebody bought gasoline for their weed whacker or their lawnmower or any other application, they're paying the tax too. Now, there were a few farmers that used enough gasoline, they could get their own tank and they could wholesale it to their own location. But again, that wasn't the norm. So, what was happening was you had people getting taxed to pay for roadway improvements when they drove their vehicle or any time that they used fossil fuels like that. Now that we're having this conversion, it's quite clear the cities and states haven't thought through how are we going to keep these roadways drivable? You know,
Yeah.
where are we going to get the money to do that? Where's that tax going to come from? And so that's where you and I sit saying, look, these things have got to change. They will change. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is that those states and localities will tend to change low because mayors want to get reelected, governors want to get reelected, and they'll say dang near anything to get reelected in today's world. They don't tend to be leaders that are thoughtful about what the future should look
No.
like. They tend to be people that can say whatever it takes to get themselves elected. And we see that now happening when we turn around and we look at commercial real estate. Okay,
Yeah. Let me
so
let me give a comment
go ahead.
on the idea here of what's happening with EVs. I think there seems to be a critical mass or tipping point, and I think we're approaching that, but I don't think we're quite there yet. As far as I wouldn't even use the word mainstream because they already are mainstream. I mean, I was just in Phoenix over the weekend, and there was lots of EVs I saw driving on the freeway. I saw a brand new Rivian. I saw Teslas. I saw even, BMWs, and I saw a Nissan Leaf and all these other ones. So it's mainstream, but it's not quite at that tipping point. What do you think it's going to take for these states and these governments to really put their money where their mouth is and make some of these things? For instance, why doesn't the city of Tucson implement more EVs in their own fleet? Right? Whether it's just the cars that people use that are in government, trash trucks, other things like that.
Well, I like that term you use, tipping point. There's an author who I have absolutely no value for named Malcolm Gladwell. He's a journalist by training, and he observes things in the world, and then he comes out with books in which he makes dramatic assertions about how to be successful. And there's no evidence behind what he said. And in fact, he says things that people go, oh, that makes sense, and they go on with it. But in fact, they're wildly off. And he wrote a book called Tipping Point. Right? He says things get to a tipping point. But the reality is, he uses the term completely incorrectly in that book. So let me go back to you. When you think about the fact you said, well, you see a lot of EVs, but you don't think it's reached the tipping point. What, in your mind, just kind of elaborate on what you think would the tipping point would look like? What percentage of cars would be electric vehicles on the roadway that you would say, oh, that's the tipping point?
51%.
51?
Yeah, I would say it's trending in that direction where gas cars are specialty cars. Maybe there's tractors and weekend cars that are still gas, but the majority of what's being sold is electric cars. The grid, the charging stations are more widespread. Cities are offering incentives. Their own vehicles are electric. You just see that. Just kind of what happened with DVDs and all these other things, right? You see just the proliferation of the technology in more and more places.
All right. Well, I'm going to back you up then, because when we actually do this kind of analysis, typically the tipping point is about 5 to 7%, sometimes 9, but it's at that level that we start to see the tipping point. And what I mean by that is that when we recognize the tipping point, we want to say, oh, there was a way we got things done, and in the future there will be a different way we get things done. All right. So
Right.
What's that tipping point at which we can say it's really going to head in that other direction? So we're going to go from 90% doing it the old way to 90% doing it the new way. So you can, an example of this, you wind the clock back 100 years ago, and people didn't have indoor plumbing in their houses, right? And so as indoor plumbing started to be developed, it required a lot of infrastructure. You had to have the water running. You couldn't have plumbing. Plumbing included water and included waste, so you had to have both pieces of it. And when it first came along, a lot of people were like, this, like you, they would say to themselves, well, this probably isn't going to happen. It's going to take a really, really long time for it to happen. But what was reality was that this launched off the idea of developments, because where there were existing houses, retrofitting the plumbing was difficult. But when people went into new developments, they said, oh, look, we're going to put plumbing in all the houses. And then what happens is people will move out of the old houses, and then we'll buy those at a lower price, and we'll retrofit those, and we'll get them back online. So the people kind of thought in terms of, well, I got to have all these houses, get to 50% or more of the houses have indoor plumbing before it's going to really happen. The truth was, once we got to about 9% of homes had indoor plumbing, then everybody wanted it. And so they used their money and their feet to go buy that. Same thing happened with mobile phones. When we first had cell phones, the price was something like $100 a month, and you were paying 50 cents a minute, and
Right.
the phones didn't hold a charge very long. But what we started to see was that by the time we had 5% of the population with a mobile phone, everybody wanted one, right? And so they were starting to say, what could we do to make that happen? And we started to see the volumes went way up, the prices went way down, and you could predict 12 years in advance that landlines were going to become obsolete. If you waited till half the population had a mobile phone, before you reacted to that, then that's what happened to the belcos. They sat there and sat there and sat there and said, okay, the quality isn't there, the costs are still high, nobody's going to give up their landline phone. People in offices are going to want landline phones, and so we assume it's going to be that way, and it could take 3, 4, 5, 6 decades before this would become obsolete technology. When in fact it took one. This took 1 decade. But the trend was really obvious at the point of about 5 to 7%, and that's right now where we are with EVs. The sales of EVs are about 7% of new car sales, right? So now take into account that's 7% of new car sales. you still have an installed fleet of all these old cars, right? So you start when you look down the road, you're not going to see 7%. You're going to see maybe 1% when you drive around Phoenix, or less than 1%. So you can say, hey, it's not at a tipping point. It's still kind of a rarity. I still notice it when I see that. Or if I saw 5 Teslas in a row, I would say, oh, look, that's 5 Teslas in a row. Isn't that unusual? But we're already there. I mean, we're already there at the point of saying, okay, we now know where the costs are. We now know where the demand is. We now know how people, where the behavior is. And we can project the cost of batteries. We can project the installation of the infrastructure. And by looking down the road, we know that in 10 years, almost everybody's going to be buying a brand new, it'll be an electric car of some kind. And all these stories about the grid not being prepared for it and not having the minerals, all that's getting washed away, right? And people that say that there's not going to be enough electricity, we're going to break the grid, don't know anything about electrical demand, electrical supply, because there's so many ways you can create supply with renewables, people charging for renewables in their own home, and being able to share. And the biggest thing in the way of that happening are regulations. In other words, problems we have with electricity today in Hawaii, in California, in Nevada, in Arizona, any of the problems we have there, we get down to it's a regulatory problem. And people are not willing to, localities aren't willing to give up their element of control in order to create balancing contracts and allow for better grid design and better grid management. How long will that remain? Well, it typically remains until there's a catastrophe. And again, that's when people start to think of a tipping point. Oh, here was a catastrophe. Now we'll finally do something about the problem. But the tipping point was far before the catastrophe. Just like we pointed out last week in Lahaina, in Maui, when for that poor town that burned down. In fact, the destruction of the wetlands, the leaving of the sugarcane crops, the forestation being rebuilt of the aggressive grasses, all of that was setting the stage for this disaster. The electric companies putting in wires, not keeping up the maintenance, letting capacitors get overheated. All of this was already happening 25, 30, 40 years prior to when the
Right,
fire
but
happened.
at one point, at a certain point, something happened. See, in my mind, that's the quote tipping point where there's already a framework in place. All these things are building up to it, and then something happens that flips it over the edge.
And I guess where I'm coming from is the tipping point is when you start saying this is inevitable. It's going to happen. The catastrophe, like you're talking about, when you get to something where that's usually the market is so far along that the completely outdated solution disappears. So we get to the point where so many people have a mobile phone and it works so well that they no longer will pay for their landline phones. So they quit. It's like whenever people were very, very happy with VHS tapes, then they went to DVDs, and then along comes streaming. And in the early days of streaming, it wasn't very convenient. You had to say at 5 o'clock, I'm going to start the download so that it's ready to watch at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. And you had to pay a price for it to use it once. You only got one viewing of it. But people thought that was inconvenient, kind of expensive. And is it really going to stick around? And they didn't believe streaming was going to be the future. But what happened was it only took 16 months until it was everything. Everybody had it, and Blockbuster was gone. Right? 16 months at that point. And you could see it coming, though. You could see it coming for a really long time. But then it was that 16 months, and just it turned it all around, right? And it killed it. And that's the thing that I think business people, they have that weak perception of a tipping point, which is that it's really the catastrophe, or it's the point at which the old thing completely disappears. Well, if you're still using the old thing when it disappears, then you're a complainer, right? You're sitting around saying, well, I was happy with the old way, and now my business is being damaged, and I wish I could have the old way back. And the reality is you couldn't. But could
it's
you
not coming back.
Sure. Because the tipping point is usually at around, like I said, 5 to 7. Sometimes if it's someone with a lot of regulations, it's more like 9. So that's what right now what we're looking at is what's going to happen with real estate. We have all this commercial real estate in the United States and a lot in Europe and definitely in China. There's a lot of commercial real estate that's unneeded. People aren't going to go to the office. We're working in a different way. We overbuilt commercial real estate. Why? Well, because they set up sections of town. So in New York City, there were places for manufacturing, places for offices, places for residential. And what they assumed is people, they would just let the price take care of it. If you want to live in Manhattan, you pay $10,000 a month. Otherwise, you're going to commute from another borough or from Connecticut or something, right? And And they were happy with that. But now all of a sudden, it doesn't make any sense, right? People aren't willing to commute. So what do we see? Well, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times both reported in the last week that New York is looking into how it can change its regulations so that they can do conversions. And they want to take a lot of the manufacturing sector on this lower southwest side and say, hey, that's not a good use of that land. We should convert that into real estate, and we'll start taking some of these commercial buildings and just completely, switching them around so that they're residential as well. And that's the regulatory piece. But if you look at it, the tipping point for this happened 2 years before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, I was working from home all the time, right? I'd done so for almost 15 years at that point.
Yeah.
But I was two different firms in which I was an officer of the firm, and I didn't have an office because I was sort of like, I'm either on the road with clients, with customers, I'm out in the marketplace, or when I'm back here, I'm just going to work from home. And if I have to have meetings, we'll go to the meeting room and I'll work in the meeting room. I'll come to the office. I'll spend the whole day in the meeting room and we'll do our meetings that way. So I did not need to have a dedicated office to sit in. And I'm talking about go back at the turn of the century. That was the way I was working. And I wasn't the only one who said that. I wasn't the only one working that way. If you went into a lot of consulting firms during the week, you'd walk up and down the halls, and 90% of the offices were empty. Why? Well, because the consultants were making the business happen, right? The
Yeah.
leaders were out selling work. And so we knew you could see that happen then. He said, this makes no sense. The tools were being developed. Skype had come along and it was being used. We had other tools. Cell phones were making things a lot more productive. So you could see this is really what's going to happen. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit, it accelerated that. It accelerated very quickly, and people got used to using it. And now we're going into the hybrid model where people are going to be doing some combination of work from home and go to the office. But the key here is to recognize we hit that tipping point. We passed that a long time ago. And the leaders, like when Jamie Dimon says, I want to make everybody come to the office, or the leaders of some of these other companies, they don't realize, look, you're honing in on something that's dead.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, you're not going to get the genie back in the bottle. And that's because people have already decided the way they're going to work. And so if you try to make them work the old way, they're going to be disgruntled. They're going to find other places to go. They're going to lie. They're going to cheat. They're going to try to do what they want to do. And it'll hurt your business if you keep going down that direction.
Very well indeed. I think that was a good explanation of the tipping point as it pertains to what's happening with EVs, and you mentioned commercial real estate. Where else do you think that there's a tipping point that we've passed with respect to some of the things happening in the news today?
Well, we're going to switch over to demographics now, and
Okay.
the reality is, I like that you talked about the genie in the bottle. If you think about an Aladdin lamp, remember the Aladdin lamp? It had this really big base and had this really tall neck. Or the old, sometimes you'll see these Chianti bottles where the base is really big and has a tall neck, and has a basket woven around the base of it. If you look at population demographics, that's kind of how the demographics look in the 1960s and 1970s. And so the average age in the United States, the median age in 1980 was 30. That was the median age, was 30 years old in the United States. What's happened is that that bottle has inverted. And now what happens is all the people are old. The big bulk of people are old. The median age now in the United States, hang on, I got it here, is 38. We've gone from 30 to 38, 39, sorry, to 39. By
Wow.
2034, the largest age group will be people over the age of 70. And we see that same thing happening in Europe. There's been a baby dearth in Europe. And now we're seeing it happening in China. And so we're kind of weaving our way from real estate to demographics. China just kept building. They're building all these houses. They're building all of these commercial buildings. And the reality is nobody's buying them now. They overbuilt. They went too far. So there's a commercial real estate disaster happening in China. And so we now have deflation. We're at the edge of deflation in China. All this stuff was very predictable. And certainly during the pandemic, everybody in the world was saying, don't do that shutdown the way you're doing it. You got to get your productivity back up because you're going to end up in a depression if you don't do something. And for political reasons, they did the wrong thing. And so they let the demographics go backwards on them. So the genie bottle is now upside down. If you thought it was hard to get the genie in the bottle when it was right side up, it's impossible when it's upside down, right? So these demographics are just fighting against you. I'm sorry, Jamie Dimon, you're 67 years old. I mean, you can stay in your job 3 or 4 more years, but it's not going to do the bank any good until somebody figures out that you need young blood. And we can see this in the population. Look, the number one thing that everybody, if you poll everybody in the United States, the one thing that gets the highest approval is nobody wants the two top candidates right now because they're too old, right? The two
Yeah.
top candidates in the two parties are both 80 years old. And people are sitting around saying, you know what, why can't we get some young blood in this game?
Yeah.
And there's young blood out there, but the system and the method, the way things are, and people are very disgusted about it. So what that's likely going to mean is we're going to have a low voter turnout in the next election, right? Because people are not motivated the way that you would like them to be motivated. And again, it gets back to this aging demographic, right? And the problem that we have, when are the young people going to be able to have a say in the future where they're going to have to support all of us anyway?
Yeah. It's all going to change. Or it's
Yeah.
already happening, actually.
So I was talking to somebody, I had a small group the other day, and we were just chatting. It wasn't a formal thing. And there were some young people in there. When I say young, they were like 30. Now, when I was 30 years old, I already owned my first house, right? None of these people had their first house. And they were saying it just seemed like a house was out of the price range. And I told them, I said, that actually makes a lot of sense. You got two things really hurting you right now. I said, one of them is you got everybody living forever. And so they don't leave their house, they stay in their house. And a lot of those people that are living forever have two houses. You know, they did well in business. They got the house they live in, and they got a second house. And they're just sitting there. There's so many empty houses in the state of California that they're thinking about putting a tax in place that says either A, you live in it, B, you rent it, or you're going to pay a big tax for letting the thing sit empty because people need these houses. So I said the aging population is going against you. And then, of course, interest rates are going against you. So with
Yeah.
interest rates at 7%, it makes the cost of the house go up dramatically. I said, I hate to tell you this, but you're probably going to live to be 85 or 90 anyway. I mean, that's just the demographics. Anybody who's 30 now has got a very, very good chance of living to 100. It's going to be just commonplace as could be. So that means you're not going to retire at 65. You're going to live longer. And in about 10 years, we're going to start seeing a boatload of people die. And as more and more and more people die, the demand is going to be less than the supply. So we're going to start seeing these houses come on the marketplace. People are going to either turn them over to the children, but a lot of these people have no children, or they have one child and two houses. I hate to say it, but I am a Harvard Business School grad. I have a number of colleagues. I have a number of colleagues that own 5 houses, and I'm just struck. Yeah, yeah. They'll have one at a ski resort, mountain area. They'll have
Yeah.
an urban house in some place like New York. I say house, I'm including big
Right.
condos, apartments, things like that. I mean, they'll have a place in New York. They might have a place in L.A. And then they might have a place in Philadelphia, and they might have a place in Miami. And it's surprising to me how many of these older people have accumulated so much real estate, and yet they don't have that many children, right? So that means when they die, this real estate's going to come on the market. And I'm kind of like, the one thing you can't deal with is babies, because I don't know that there's a magic any medicine out there that's going to say that a woman at age 42 will find it as easy to both become pregnant and carry a pregnancy as she does at age 24. So right now, what we have is an economic situation that favors waiting until you're in your 40s to really kind of explode
Right.
into the marketplace. But the reality of human nature, of us as people, is that you probably can't. We need to start getting married or getting attached with other people and joining and forming families. So it's kind of like you have to look ahead and say it's going to be rough for a while, but it's probably going to work its way out.
Yeah.
We have
Very, very
this is a little statistic, but we're going into the election, right? And
right.
the last election, we do know that in the last two elections passed, the winner of the election lost the popular vote, right? And then that same candidate lost the popular vote in the re-election campaign that next year, all right? But one of the things we did looking at the voting patterns was that the Republican candidate who became president in 2016 um, was very supported by an older demographic, right? The older demographics tended to vote more for that Republican candidate, and the younger demographics tended to vote more for the Democratic candidate. Well, since 2020, no, since 2016, 32 million people have become eligible to vote due to age, meaning they've aged up into the voting brackets. Okay, they've
Okay.
reached over 18. 32 million people added to the roll by going over the age of 18. We've had 20 million people, elderly people, those over 65, die. 20 million have died. That's a 52 million vote swing. In other words, if the older demographic dies off and the younger demographic comes of age to vote, you add those together, you get 52 million people that have they were more likely, if they vote, to vote for a Democratic candidate. And this is some of the implications of demographics that people don't sort of think about, because they sit there and say, well, okay, we know that, these profiles, but have we really thought through what's going to happen, with this voting, when we get to the next election? Because it's sort of like a lot of ways we think that the next election is going to be like the last election, but in fact, just something as simple as demographics swings 52 million potential votes. That's more than enough to
Yeah,
completely
that's
change
massive.
outcome of an election, right? So these demographics do end up making a tremendous amount of difference. Um, in 1984, people under the age of 40 were 60% of the workforce. Okay, that's 1984. We're winding the clock back 30 years, right? So now, is that 40? No, yeah, 40 years. 40 years.
40
Sorry,
years.
40
Yeah.
years. Today, those people under the age of 40 are only 45% of the workforce. So 55% of
Wow.
the workforce is over the age of 40. So that starts telling you that we have a real problem with Social Security, and this idea that you can retire at 65 and you're going to be able to draw a pension for the rest of your life off the government. And in fact, all of the estimates that are being done by all of the agencies that do the comparisons now say that by the year 2033, there will be more money going out of Social Security than coming in. Under the best, most optimistic scenarios, there will be more money going out than coming in. The population of China is in decline. The population of Japan is in decline. The population of Europe is in decline. They've lost 447 million people in Europe in the last year. The total population is down 447 million people.
Wow.
What does that mean? It means we all better start getting used to seeing a lot more Indians. And I mean that very seriously. If we look around you, we do notice that Indra Nooyi, who was born and raised in India, she became the chairman of PepsiCo. She was a colleague of mine in early my career and was a friend for a while. Um, People thought that was really exceptional. No longer is it exceptional to see an Indian in a
No.
senior leadership position in many of these companies.
Well, yeah. I
Why?
mean,
Well,
Google. I mean,
because
they're all over the place for sure.
yeah, there are more. If you looked at okay, who are the best students in high school, right? You look at that top 10%, right? The honor students that are at the top 10%. The top 5% of the Indian honor roll students is a bigger number than everyone in high school in the United States. That's
Right.
the population is just so much bigger. It's over
Yeah.
4 times larger than the United
And
States.
isn't it younger as well?
Yes, definitely. Skews definitely much younger. So what can we expect? Well, I saw a clip the other day of a Trump rally in which they had him on. He was on a platform and he said, our country is full. I think I saw this on a CNN report or sometime. And the comment just really struck me because at that particular moment and where he was, it was a popular thing to say for him. But it's such a obviously not true question. I mean, our country isn't full. Japan isn't full. China isn't full. All of our countries desperately need more people to come into the country to do jobs,
Hmm.
right? And I started doing this 15 years ago when I was telling groups. I said, I don't care what the immigration policy is from year to year to year. Eventually, you're going to sit there and say, there is nobody that's going to help me with my crutches. There's nobody that's going to help me get in and out of the bathtub. There's nobody that's there. I didn't have enough children, or my children are busy, or they're gone. I need help. And the only way you're going to get help is immigration. And if you look at the demographics, the only place you're going to find those demographics is by and large India. Then the second place would be from Africa, right? But Africa has a lot of problems with their demographics, largely because of the fact they can't seem to stay out of wars. They have all these wars between themselves and all the different countries of Africa. They keep killing off their young people all the time. So that makes it problematic for Africa. But what it means is that we should be very welcoming of Indians. Now, why is it that we do tend to be more welcoming of Indians than we do some other countries? Is because, again, the ones who make it to America tend to be bright. It's not easy to get into
Right.
America, so they have to work hard at it. So the brighter people work harder. They get into schools, they get advanced degrees, and they get to America, and then they use their advanced degrees and their their hard skill sets, and they say, look, we should continue to be here and continue to work. And so you start seeing more Indians around everywhere you go, and the fact that we have some people that look around and say that America is a white Protestant country. Really belies the reality, right? I
No,
mean,
we're
it was
we're way past that tipping point for sure.
yes, way past that. Yet it's more than 50% of the population is still white, and more than 50% of the population is Protestant. So, if we go back to that thought process about what the tipping point is, we can see, wait a minute, we're not there, but it's inevitable. Right now it's inevitable. And we're going to have to bring in more immigrants. It's the only way we're going to be able to keep the economy growing. So even when people are sitting here saying stop, we can't stop. The money that we're wasting keeping people south of the border, the United States, is ridiculous. When you sit there and say, instead of trying to fight a war against those people, let's figure out an intelligent way to bring them in, see what skills they have and put them to work.
Yeah.
And put them into what kind of training programs to give them skills so they could go to work. And that's just one border. I've said over and over again, we should be flying 747s full of people from the Ukraine, from Poland, people that are affected by the war, to the United States and offering them jobs. There's bricklayers, there's electricians, there's carpenters, there's
scientists.
Yeah. And we should be opening up the borders and saying, hey, we need you. We desperately need you in our country because we have all these jobs. For the last 2 years, we've had something near 150% or 1.5 times more job openings than we've had unemployed people. So here you have the head of the Federal Reserve trying to say, oh, we need to raise interest rates to cool off the economy. Well, as long as there's more demand for people than there are people, then wages are going to go up, right? And I'm sorry, Jerome Powell, you can't do anything to stop that, right?
No.
So what we need, if we want to try to cool off wage inflation, is we need to bring more people into the country. And our process about how we're trying to handle it at this time is just completely wrong. I mean, the idea of trying to say we're just going to stop all these people and not let them in is such a foolish approach.
I had a meeting with a friend of mine over the weekend on Friday, actually, and he runs a manufacturing company here in town that does a lot of things for the government, things that you really can't send out overseas. And he's got 9 employees, and right now he's got more than a year's worth of backlog. And I asked him, well, what's happening here? He says, I just can't find people. I can't find qualified people. And he's spent the better part of a year looking for 2 employees, and he's had almost no luck. He's brought people in and they don't last. They go to the next thing. And so, having a wellspring of capable, willing people that come in the country that really want to add value, I think it has to happen. There's got to be a way that this sort of breaks through and becomes reality.
Yeah, I mean, you could take every immigrant and you could give them a card similar to a Social Security card, and you could say, you want to stay in our country, that's great, but you got to stay employed, and we'll track that. And if you don't keep yourself employed, then, we'll send you out for 3-6 months, and then you find a job, we'll let you back in again, But we could track it and manage it in such a much more effective way to help with our economic problems. The best performing country in Europe for the last 15 years has been Germany. And I don't know if you remember, but there used to be an East Germany and a West Germany, and East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, and all kinds of stories about the Berlin Wall and people trying to find ways across it, et cetera, that kind of thing. And so one day, Soviet Union is crumbling, and West Germany said, we're going to annex East Germany. And most people in the United States and around the world said, this is really nuts, because East Germany is a terrible economy. The people there have been not educated as well. They haven't been trained as well. The cars they have are bad. The apartments they have are bad. It's like a third world compared to West Germany. But what the German leadership said was, we need this in order to grow Germany. And if we bring on East Germany, we will be able to dramatically improve our productivity by having all these extra people that will come in. And it worked splendidly. They became the largest economy in Europe, and they've done extraordinarily well, and they've had their productivity go up. As migrants have come into Europe, you have people trying to escape from Africa, you have people trying to escape from wars over in the Middle Eastern areas. They come to Greece, they come to Turkey, and what they all say is they want to try to get to Germany. And Germany has accepted more immigrants than any other country in Europe, and it is by far and away the best performing economy in all of Europe. And that's the lesson we need to learn, is that you need to be open in your mind about what immigration can do for you as a positive, and then you can manage the immigration rather than trying to turn it off. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand tipping points, and a lot of people don't understand trends, and we tend to see a lot of government activity that happens far, far too late.
Very well said, Adam. I think this is a very illustrating podcast, and we definitely let the genie out of the bottle on lots of things. And it's good that we have this as a forum, and we invite those listeners who are interested in communicating with Adam and I, Manny at sparkpartners.com, Adam at sparkpartners.com. and we're here every week to discuss what genies we can get let out of what bottles, and we look at trends and do it in a very fun and educating manner. So with that, Adam, we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.